Immediate family. We are going to be talking about immediate family. We're going to be looking at what an immediate family is, why it's important, and how it can impact a teenager's life. First of all, let's define our terms. What is an immediate family? Immediate family is classified as an individual's parents, brothers and sisters, husbands or wife, and children. For a teenager, and for the sake of this presentation, for a teenager, immediate family member will be their parents and their siblings. In this presentation that I will be presenting, we will examine the significance of the parents and the siblings on a teenager. And we're also going to be looking at how we as youth ministers can bring an impact into a teenager's life. Now let's look. So why is immediate family important? Why are we discussing this? Let's find out. Well, research shows parents are the biggest influence on teenagers' life. So let's look at this. A teenager can and will most likely be influenced by their parents, an immediate family. So first of all, in faith, they will be shaped by their parents. Their faith will most likely be influenced by their parents and their siblings. Second of all, in relationship skills, how they interact with other people, how they have social cues, these things will be based upon, will be influenced by their parents, whether that's on the good side or the bad side, and also their learning abilities. Studies show that teenagers who are from a stable family dynamics tend to show a better performance in academics. On the other hand, if the teenagers are not from a family with a stable family dynamics, the performance tend to drop. And let's also talk about sense of security. Depending on what kind of family dynamics that they're from, their sense of security can be on the other sides of the spectrums. So if they are from a stable family household, they'll have a sense of security, they'll feel secure, they'll feel safe in the house. But on the other hand, if they are not from a stable family dynamics, they won't have the sense of security with them. They'll always have some sort of fear and instability with them. And also their values will be shaped by their immediate families. Values, what are some values that we can think of? Religion, family, treating other people, hospitality, loving other people, and even basic etiquettes and social cues. So these values will be influenced by their immediate family. Now let's talk about how immediate family can shape the faith of a teenager. So immediate family influence household salvation. First of all, let's look at the father. So let's look at the statistics here. This statistics is about household salvation depending on which member of an immediate family becomes the first believer. If a teenager or a kid becomes the first believer in the household, there is a 3.5 probability, 3.5 chance that the whole family will be saved. This is a case when a teenager becomes saved, first one to become saved. Now let's look at the mother. There's a 17% probability of household salvation if the mother becomes the first believer of the household. Now lastly, let's look at the father. There's a 93% chance that the household salvation will occur if the fathers are the first ones to become a follower. So this statistics shows you how foundational fathers are in terms of teenagers' faith and also just the family's salvation. Now let's go on to the mother. Mothers are very important. Mothers have a huge role in bringing influence in family faith. If fathers are like the foundation for the salvation of the family, mothers are the rest of the building materials. They shape the culture of a house. So now let's look at this data right here. Teenagers receive spiritual guidance from their mothers the most. Now let's look at this data. Do you see this data right here? If you see the blue right here, let me see. Mothers, by far the greatest influence in each category, encourages them to go to church, sets an example, talks about God, talks about the Bible, talks about tradition. By far, teen spiritual guidance and encouragements come from the mother and also their father. If you look at the statistics here, the pink is the father. Yeah, what an odd color. But anyways, pink. If you look at the pink right here, pink and blue are the biggest, are the longest, are in terms of this graph here. And next is the grandparents, which is an extended family, and we'll be talking about that by another student. But you see, this data shows you that uh, mothers and fathers are a major influence in teenagers' life right here. Now let's look at this green color. Siblings do play a role, but not as much as their parents. In terms of spiritual guidance, mom and dad are the greatest influence. Now let's look at the siblings. Siblings are the green right here. So green, it tends to be a lot lower compared to mother and the father. But let's look at this data right here. This data shows you something different. If you look at the green, this is teenagers' time spent on household members. So let's look at this graph. In terms of immediate time spent with immediate families, siblings are pretty high in terms of percentage. So what does this chart show us? This chart shows us how teenagers spend their time. Teenagers spend a lot of time with their siblings. Siblings may not be the greatest factor in shaping teens' faith, but are a major mutual influence. They can mutually encourage one another far more than their friends can, because they tend to spend more time with their siblings whenever they're going through some difficulties, whenever they have questions about faith. Their siblings are always with them to talk about certain issues. Now let's look at this video. The video that we'll be looking at is about toddlers. It's not actually about teenagers, but this video shows us something very significant about how family dynamics can affect even when a teenager is a toddler. So let's look at this video.
Emmanuel, élevé dans sa famille, est avide de saisir tout objet nouveau en vue d'une exploration active. Le passer d'une main à l'autre, le porter à la bouche, par exemple. Totalement absorbé par ces manipulations, l'enfant prête peu d'attention à son entourage. Christine, régulièrement confiée à une crèche de jour, ne semble pas présenter un comportement différent de celui de l'enfant précédent. Les récupère quand ils tombent. Elle aussi est tout absorbée par son jeu. Ces deux exemples nous ont montré le cas d'enfants dont les conditions familiales offrent toute sécurité. Par contre, lorsque ces conditions sont défavorables, au point de nécessiter un retrait et une hospitalisation, le comportement du nourrisson va s'en ressentir, ainsi qu'en témoigneront les séquences suivantes. Caroline, dont la mère s'est médiocrement souciée, est anorexique. Cet enfant porte bien la main à un cube, mais en fait elle s'y intéresse faiblement. Très souvent, elle jette un regard interrogateur autour d'elle. Son exploration reste active, mais elle semble surtout préoccupée par son entourage. Dans les cas qui vont suivre, le souci croissant de l'environnement et l'inquiétude décuplée auront pour corrélatif un amoindrissement de l'attention prêtée au jeu. Par exemple, Véronique, également anorexique, manifeste son refus en écartant ses mains d'un geste d'évitement. Si finalement elle saisit un cube, les regards inquiets qu'elle jette autour d'elle témoignent de son anxiété. Son attitude est figée, elle ne joue pas. Jean, retiré très tôt à sa famille et hospitalisé après plusieurs placements, épie attentivement les gestes du psychologue. La carence affective dont cet enfant a souffert semble faire primer chez lui le besoin de contact social qu'on pourrait motiver par le désir intense de l'enfant de trouver un substitut maternel. L'intérêt porté aux objets nouveaux est nul. Il acceptera sans résistance, mais sans intérêt véritable, le cube que l'on place dans sa main.
Now let's talk about problems in today's culture. I think one of the biggest problems is divorce. Average lifetime of marriage is 40 to 50%, 50%, which is very, very low in terms of lifetime of marriage. It's estimated that 60% children will live in single-parent household. This leaves the teenagers to be very vulnerable. Less time with their parents, and then obviously, as we have talked about, less time with parents mean less influence of the good things, like in terms of values and social cues and um, learning abilities, even. And there's more opportunities for external influences that may be negative, actually, by other friends that may not lead them to a right direction. It may leave the teens unprotected. Domestic violence and other form of abuse, and also etc. So, divorce does tend to leave the teenagers in a much vulnerable setting. Now let's talk about neglect. Teenagers face neglect from their parents in terms of faith. Teenagers who don't have parents will not be able to have spiritual guidance and support. As you have seen in that chart, spiritual guidance mostly come from their parents, and youth parents are not enough. Again, I'll repeat: youth pastors are not enough. Let's look at this data again. This is the data we just looked at. Let us see this graph, but this time with the absence of the mother. Do you see the difference here? That's how much influence is taken away from a teenager. Now let's look at the chart again without their fathers. Do you see the difference here? If you even take out the extended family, like grandparents, who is shaping the teenager's life? It's most likely their friends and other people that's outside of the immediate family. This leaves the teenagers to be more vulnerable to external influences. Let's talk about youth ministry. If you are in youth ministry, great, but do not expect that you can change the teenager's life as much as their parents can. Youth ministers can bring a great impact on teenagers' spiritual life and spiritual guidance, but will not be able to do much as their parents will be able to. Now, let's look at this percentage right here. 5.3%. Assuming that teenagers sleep 8 hours a day, they have 112 awake hours in a week. So why is it significant? Let's look at this. See, if you as a youth minister spend at least 6 hours with a youth kid in a week during their time they're awake, you're only in their life for 5.3% of their week. Now let's say you don't spend 6 hours, but you spend 4 hours. That's 3.5% of their week. Now let's say you spend only 2 hours with a youth kid. You're only in the youth kid's life for 2.6%. That's significantly lower than what the parents spend their time with. So don't expect ourselves, like youth ministers, to bring a huge impact on the teenager's life. We can, of course, be able to impact them in a positive way, but the most positive influence that teenagers can have is from their parents. Now let's look at what the scripture tells us. What does the scripture tell us? In Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 7, it says this. I'll read it for you guys. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Now see this. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. In summary, teach your children every opportunities that you have. As youth ministers, as people who have responsibilities of teaching people in church, we must be able to minister to the youth kids, but at the same time be able to educate the parents. How important teaching the children about faith and about God, about the scriptures, about how we must spend our time with God, how we interact with God. So these kinds of values can only come from their parents, and their majority of their influence will be from their parents. So as youth ministers, as teachers, as pastors of the churches, we must be able to successfully also educate the parents and their immediate family as well. So this will wrap up our presentation.